Small Spaces, Chapter 18. Okay, maybe Miss Webster traded us to the Smiling Man, and so we ended up here. But how do we get out of here? How do we get everyone out of here? Ollie didn't know, but she felt urgently that she ought to know. That there was a piece of the puzzle that had escaped her. It was one thing solving puzzles in math class, but now their lives were on the line and Ollie didn't have a clue. Brian and Coco had gotten to the opening of the covered footbridge. They stopped. Ollie caught up with them. The covered bridge, which had looked okay from far away, was actually pretty rotten, its planking splintering into the creek below. They could see the water through the holes. Coco said unhappily, I didn't know there would be so many scarecrows on the farm, or that the bridge would look like that. We have to hurry, said Ollie. We can get there before dark. The bridge isn't that bad. A dubious silence. The entrance to the bridge looked like a hungry black mouth. Okay, said Brian, taking a deep breath. Great. Without another word, he started across. The timber groaned under his feet. Once he slipped and grabbed a beam so he wouldn't fall into the water. Coco said, oh my gosh, and followed him across. Ollie hung back. Despite her bravado, she hated heights. Yes, this bridge wasn't that high, but the timbers were soft and black, slimy and splintery, and Ollie could see the gray water rushing below. Coco was already at the middle of the bridge. Brian got to the other side and turned to watch the girls. Coco put a foot through a rotted plank, squeaked, and skipped over to the next plank. It groaned under her weight. I'm scared, she said so that only Ollie could hear her. Ollie was still on the far side. She forced herself to take a step. It was that or stay alone on this side of the bridge with nowhere to hide and night coming on. Step. The rotten wood bent beneath her feet. Step. Don't look down. She hadn't always hated heights. Her mother used to take her flying on the weekends. Ollie had loved it. The rumble and soar of the plane, bright sunshine all around, clouds like giant fish, the ground falling away. Step. At the funeral, they had her mother's casket closed. It was easy to believe that her mother wasn't in there at all, that she was just at a conference or something and would come home any minute, kiss Ollie's dad and say, good adventures today, Olivia? Easier to imagine than to imagine the ground coming up bigger, bigger, biggest, falling. Ollie was halfway across the bridge, high above the creek, and memory had paralyzed her. Mom fell. I could fall. Ollie, Coco called. Ollie, come on! She had to move. She had to, but she couldn't. Ollie, hurry! Ollie tried to lift her foot. Failed. Voices at the other end of the bridge arguing. She could barely hear them over the roaring in her own head. The water gurgled below. In her head was the rush and surge of ground coming up to meet her. She couldn't see anything else. Then a face thrust itself between her and a memory. A ridiculously pretty face with angelic blue eyes and pinkish hair. Coco, hot Coco, Coco Puff, she of the dumb name and the ridiculous hair, she who cried all the time. Coco was taking Ollie's hand, standing light as a climber on rotten wood. Come on, Ollie, she said. Come on, step, just one step. We can't stay here. Ollie stepped. Coco stepped back. Now another one. Come on. Ollie took another step. She wasn't falling. She wasn't going to fall. Coco's blue eyes promised it, and her thin hands, strong hands, Ollie realized. Coco didn't cry because she was weak. Coco cried because she felt things. Ollie never cried because she didn't feel things. Not anymore, not really. She tried not to feel things. Step and step. One more, and then the bridge ended. Ollie stumbled off, blind, and realized that she was crying now, hands over her face. She knelt on the stony path at the mouth of the covered bridge, and she cried. She didn't even know really what she was crying for, whether it was from fear, tiredness, or for her mom at last. It's okay, Coco said. Don't feel bad. When I went climbing the first time, I froze at the top of the wall. They had to pry me down. Please don't cry. I'm not, said Ollie weakly. Then she scrubbed her hands down her face. I'm not, she repeated more firmly. She stood up. I'm okay now. Thanks, Coco. You saved me back there. Coco beamed. Don't mention it. Ollie looked around. Where's Brian? Startled, Coco said. I don't know. He was just... Guys, get over here now! Brian's shout came from the direction of the vegetable garden. Ollie and Coco hurried up the sloping path. The first of the scarecrows stood right on the edge of the fenced-in dead garden. Head a little flopped to one side. Brian was standing in front of it, his hand over his mouth. What is it? Said Coco. That scarecrow, Ollie said, panting a little. Does it look familiar? Yes, Brian whispered, because it's wearing Phil's clothes, because that's Phil's hat and Phil's hair and kind of Phil's face if it were sewn on. That's Phil. No, said Coco, or that might not be Phil. It just looks like him weirdly. Brian started to cry. That's Phil, he insisted. That's really Phil, just like the scarecrows outside the cottage, Caleb and Jonathan. That's what the smiling man does. He makes scarecrows. He's going to make us all scarecrows. No, said Coco, looking scared. That's not it. That can't be it. Why would he do that? Ollie said nothing. She agreed with Brian. The scarecrow was Phil, done in thread and yarn. The height, the backward cap, everything. His hands ended in 2 garden forks. She put a hand, a little uncertain, on Brian's shaking shoulder. I'm sure that we can find a way to fix it. Brian's eyes were wet. Fix it? That's my best buddy. Even if he is annoying sometimes, and he's a scarecrow, a scarecrow. Maybe he's dead. Maybe that's not him anymore. Ollie grabbed Brian's shoulders and spun him around so that he wasn't facing the scarecrow. He's not dead, Ollie said firmly. We're going to figure this out. We are. Brian, if we panic, we'll end up scarecrows too. She had no doubt it was true. Brian drew a shuddering breath. Okay, he said. Okay. To Phil the scarecrow, he said, don't worry, buddy. If you're in there, we're going to save you. We'll change him back, Brian, said Coco, with what Ollie thought was impressive sincerity, seeing that Phil had humiliated her in front of the whole school. I know we will. There has to be a way to fix it, Ollie said. Like Narnia in winter, that got fixed. Or Sleeping Beauty when the castle all woke up. That's what we have to do. Brian wiped his eyes. Okay, he said again, straightening his shoulders. But I'm only kissing Phil if I absolutely have to. Ollie and Coco stared at him, and then the 3 laughed. Their laughter was feeble, but it helped. Ollie glanced again at the cornfield, and his crowd of scarecrows were in the crowd of scarecrows. Were they moving? Just out of sight, getting ready for night? That's Jenna and Lily, Coco whispered, pointing at 2 scarecrows just visible in the kitchen garden. The 2 scarecrows were holding hands, their mouths identical frightened O's. Let's try the house first, said Ollie after a long, grim look at the girls' frozen faces. Like my watch said. They went around the kitchen garden and passed behind the tool shed, whose splintering door hung crooked. They skirted the red barn. Everywhere scarecrows. In the garden, along the paths, Ollie, Brian, and Coco recognized many of them. Others they didn't. Some of the scarecrows wore old-fashioned hats and dresses. Others wore jeans, carried backpacks. Coco was shaking her head. No, she said, they can't all be people. Ollie and Brian didn't say anything. Come on, said Ollie. Let's try the house. Up next, chapter 19.